Well, this is such a wild season, isn't it? I mean, we're all just busy. Back to school, we've got kids' soccer, we've got dance classes, work events. The fourth quarter push at work is coming up, and for those of you in big church world, you're looking at that big post-summer attendance wave coming in, and I don't know, there's just something about the fall that gets us all so busy. And then we start to stumble into the holidays exhausted, and then we crawl across New Year's broke, making resolutions about what we're going to do different next time. But can you imagine for a moment what it would look like to step energetically into the new year? What would it be like to not be defined by our busyness and exhaustion? What would it look like to not be enslaved by others' expectations and to actually live on purpose and in step with God's voice? I want to suggest to you that this is possible. And I want to talk to you today about the most ignored command in the Bible. I want to talk to you about Sabbath. Now, I just described Sabbath as the most ignored command because we hear churches talk all the time on things like tithing and serving. But what about resting? And isn't this just the way that we are, though? We will emphasize what is convenient at the expense of what is healthy. But let me tell you that picking up your cross to follow Christ and burning yourself out are not the same thing. In fact, busyness is often the main hindrance to living a life fully surrendered to Christ. So when we think of Sabbath, we probably think about Old Testament rules, right? I mean, many people are even quick to point out that we aren't under Old Covenant anymore. So this is irrelevant. We are under a new covenant in Christ, right? But what I want to present to you is that Sabbath rest is a loving imitation of God, not a lawful obligation. So look at Genesis 2 with me. In this passage, we find the first mention of rest. It tells us that on the seventh day, God had finished his work and he rested. And God blessed that day and he set it apart. So here's what I want you to remember. God set the precedent for Sabbath. In other words, God never asked his people to do something that he didn't do himself. Then in Exodus 20 is where we get the command. God says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, set apart. And it goes on to describe how God rested on the seventh day after finishing his work. So the command to follow, the command to God's people to follow God's footsteps is a command that's not based on this new idea. It's based on the precedent that God set. This is an invitation to imitate God's ways. So we've looked at the precedent and the command. Now let's look at the context. First, let me ask you, would Israel have been permitted to observe a day of rest and worship while they were enslaved in Egypt? No way. Now I ask you, what had just happened to Israel before they received the command to keep God's Sabbath? Well, they were delivered from slavery. So this is really significant. Sabbath was given as a gift from the restless condition of slavery. God was making it very clear that you are not in bondage anymore. You see, God doesn't set us free just to send us back into slavery. God sets us free so that we can know his ways. And one of the first things that he does is to invite us into his rest. Matthew 11:28 through 30 says this. Jesus says, are you tired and worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me, work with me, watch how I do it, learn the unforced rhythms of grace, and I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. We see this reinforced in Hebrews 4, verse 3. It assures us that we who have believed enter God's rest, but it's followed by a challenge and a warning. It says, today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. Listen, nothing will harden our hearts faster than restless existence. So my closing question to you is simply this. How are you going to respond to God's invitation to rest?